And so tonight, our topic is why angels dance on pinheads. Why would that be? So my background and my training in graduate work is in history, and specifically in medieval history, medieval European history. And so I've mentioned a couple times, and so if you have already seen this, about just this general paradigm that we've inherited in the West of history and what even the word medieval means. Conceptually, in the modern era, which I'm just kind of, for convenience here, starting at 1453 and moving forward in ancient era, maybe ending at 476. Why those dates? Yeah. So what happened in 1453?
I think the fall of Baghdad or of Byzantium.
Fall of Constantinople, exactly. Leandro has the microphone, so we'll have to have him come back with that. And the other one is essentially the fall of Rome. But again, it's somewhat arbitrary, the exact date there. Sometimes people will have the modern era beginning in 1492 or any other thing. So essentially in that kind of time period. And also, this is the kind of ending of antiquity, the winding down, the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. And so the idea of that is then, ancient era ends with the fall of the Western Empire. The modern era begins kind of with the Renaissance. And the idea of the people that the people in the Renaissance had was that when they're talking about rebirth and Renaissance, they really meant that they had really got the ancient times, everything had been going all the way through ancient times, and now they picked up right where they left off. And so essentially there is no difference here. It's all this yellow time. There had been all this yellow time before, and now it's yellow again. So there's a rebirth of Roman civilization, a Renaissance, and they were able to pick up right where they'd left off before Rome fell. And so then that leftover part between those two eras is that middle part. And so obviously nobody in the Middle Ages had called themselves, they didn't wake up and suddenly think that they were living in the Middle Age, in the same way that all the people in BC times are not counting down till zero, right? So we now kind of think of it that way when we look at it in retrospect. But anyway, even then the word medieval is simply Latin for this medium aevum, which is to say middle age. So that's the same modern term for this kind of time period. We're going to have a lecture in the future of when Gothic architecture was called modern. Because in the Middle Ages, when they developed this entirely brand new kind of architecture that the Romans hadn't been able to do before, the pointed arch, all of these buttresses, and they got to be able to build churches, cathedrals so much taller than had ever been had before. They didn't call themselves Goths or anything like that. They called it modern architecture. And so anyway, that was what everybody's modern. Now we're already in the postmodern time period. But anyway, so modern is a moving term, just like now. So anyway, despite then this paradigm of this perfect continuity of yellow times separated by this blue middle time, if we were to actually draw things out, we would see that everything in time is built on and is in continuity with everything that went before it. And so to get to where we are in the yellow modern times, it went through a spectrum that's going back into the medieval times. And in fact, antiquity is not like modernity. Antiquity is more removed and is more foreign to us than the Middle Ages, which actually we have much more in common with than we do with antiquity. And so that, anyway, is the actual history as opposed to that inherited paradigm. So one of the things that we've inherited in our paradigm is also then this bias that we have against that whole medieval times or Middle Ages that we want to throw out. And so one of the complaints, for example, that modern philosophers, and apparently this is especially true, Protestants after the Protestant Reformation, looking back on always with bias against what they now perceive as Catholic thinkers in the Middle Ages. The modern claim is that medieval philosophy is essentially totally devoted to abstruse and worthless arguments like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And that has been repeated a lot until the present day. But I'm going to say that in this case, it turns out that this is another one of these straw men that modern people have made up but can't actually be traced to the complaint itself. So in the same exact way that one of the things we have as in our modern playbook of sensibilities that we know is true, that Columbus in sailing west was busily proving that the world was round, and that as the farther he got, the more scared all his sailors got that they were about to fall off the edge of the world. That this story has no basis in fact, that it's an absolute myth. That they did not think that the world was flat, and indeed nobody in the Middle Ages thought that the world was flat. And likewise, it turns out that this question of angels dancing on the head of pins was actually never posed at all by a medieval theologian or a philosopher. And so it's essentially the kind of thing that modern people made up to denigrate their immediate predecessors as part of this argument that they aren't emerging out of this thing that just came before them. They have nothing in common with it, and instead that they are Rome, the ancient classic period reborn. This is an example in one medieval illustration or one diagram of the cosmos that on the one hand does show that maybe not in a perfect sense, but it does show that the universe or the cosmos is perceived by medieval people as a sphere. They've drawn here a sphere with the circle. The Earth is a sphere in the middle of a series of concentric circles or celestial spheres. And you can see here, though, that it also, though, touches on this point about angels. So it's not that the medieval people didn't talk about angels. They didn't talk about them in connection with pinheads, but they did talk about them in connections with other things. And one of the things that they're talking about here is the perception that anybody has in antiquity or the Middle Ages or any time, that the universe is in motion. We note that as we now understand in our heliocentric solar system, that the Earth is going around the sun, and it takes about a year. But when you do that, positions in the sky change over the course of a year. We also know every day that we're going from day to night, and so in fact, if you look out and take a time-lapse photo, all the stars move in a big circle around the pole star, right? You've seen pictures like that. Well, so this motion here is being portrayed in this particular medieval diagram of all those spheres by angels that are sitting there turning cranks, And so you can see the angels here. They've each got a crank, and that's making the whole cosmos go around. And so the idea here then is that angels are being depicted as the personification of natural forces. They are the force here. This is the force of whatever is keeping the universe in motion. They're not the first cause, as Aristotle and also all the successors through the Middle Ages would say. There is a prime unmoved mover that is the cause ultimately of all motion, but that prime mover, which is to say God, is not directly causing anything else to move in the physical world, but instead there are unseen layers of intermediary forces, in some first spiritual forces, then physical forces that cause all that motion to occur in the actual physical universe. So essentially the idea here that's being portrayed is there is some unseen force that is causing the spheres of the stars to move, that we observe, that all the stars move around and all the planets move against the stars and the sun and the moon move against that. And so what is that unseen force that's causing that? We gave that force the name angel in medieval theology and philosophy. So when we are doing kind of cause and effect, and we're just doing observational things, some cause and effect is quite easy to grasp. You got one of these dominoes, you touch it, and it goes. So there's an interesting physical principle here of transferring the momentum and things like that. But this is the energy that is where each upright thing has in it. Anyway, that's all being expended. But you can definitely get how this happens. Once you see motion happening, something's physically being touched. On the other hand, some other things, and things that they're even quite aware of, they have magnets in the Middle Ages, and it's the people in the Middle Ages who invent compasses for navigation, they can use for navigation. And so how this exactly works, this kind of force at a distance that happens with magnets. I mean, when you were a kid, you probably had magnets and played with them. Maybe you still do that as an adult. It can be fun. I've played with magnets not that long ago anyway, because they're very interesting to watch how their properties work and flipping around and things like that. So exactly how that is working, obviously with magnetic fields and things like that, is not as easy to immediately understand, what's causing that or how that can happen without anything touching, right? And gravity is also kind of like that, which is, it's not that we don't understand gravity, but it's that we don't all of us, every one of us are able to explain, how gravity warps space, and how that all works. And again, how gravity is exerting, at a distance, force at a distance, when you're within those kind of gravitational fields of the two objects, right? So
we still don't know why.
And Elizabeth says we still don't know why. So anyway, then I'm just going to suggest here that given those things, if we exercise a little bit of generosity, we might understand better what medieval people meant when they're using the word angel to describe the invisible natural forces that act as intermediary, secondary causes between the physical universe that they observe and the what they argued, by reason and also by faith, must be the first cause of all that motion. So there's got to be something that is the first cause, that is the cause of all motion everywhere, is their argument. And there must be something that is the reason why, since we all have existence, there must be something that is the cause of that being. And so their argument is ultimately, going back to based on Plato and Aristotle, and also on their religious faith, that can all be traced to a unmoved mover, a prime mover, the source of being, goodness itself, which they all agree is God. So, but in between God and everything that happens, there are all sorts of forces, which we would now call things like gravity, that are the actual proximate cause of any of these things as opposed to the first cause. Okay, just to shift ground here. So we're talking about angels. So according to Gallup's most recent poll of the question, which apparently is from 2016, what percentage of Americans believe in angels? What do we guess?
Too many.
Too many, Elizabeth says.
75%?
75%, so exactly. Yeah, so you're within the margin of error in your guess. So 72% plus or minus 4 say they believe in angels, Americans, and only 16% say they don't believe in angels, with 10% being not sure. So that's a pretty rock solid supermajority, for a particular question. Not a lot of things have that kind of certainty. Certainly not human-caused climate change, which is, we have a pretty strong scientific consensus, but not anyway, survey consensus. So what do those people, though, believe in? So they're saying here, a supermajority, they're saying they believe in something using the name angel. But already, I think as we've already seen with with my medieval diagram, and I was talking about secondary causation and unseen forces affecting the physical universe, that may well already express a different use of the word angel than maybe a lot of people in the United States are thinking when they say they believe in it. So that's no surprise, because there's popular beliefs in all kinds of things without, let's say, being informed about what that thing might be. so it completely be that way. So instead of sharing, I'm going to suggest, although I don't have any kind of further details. I don't know that they asked a bunch of follow-up questions in the Gallup poll. But rather than sharing a single belief, I think it seems quite likely that these 72% of Americans who say they believe in angels, they actually have a wide variety of different beliefs about things that then they all call under the term angel, right? So they may well have kinds of different ideas about what they mean when they're saying that they believe in angels. So let's look at some of these kind of frequent depictions. This is a great play and also mini-series by two-part miniseries by HBO, I think, called Angels in America. So in popular culture and art, angels are generally depicted as heavenly beings that look like humans with wings. Generally, they have white robes because heaven hates pants. And radiant. They're radiant, which is to say light. They're associated with light. Conventionally, in paintings, that's shown with drawing a halo around the head in iconography. They're also often shown as being androgynous. So you maybe can't tell if it's a man or a woman. Sometimes women playing a man, or vice versa, in stage and that kind of thing. And then also usually very beautiful. And because of the Western biases, often that means white, but not always anymore. So depending on now, as there are angels of all colors and new 21st century depictions especially. They're also frequently depicted as winged children or babies. And these are sometimes called cherubs, so a very particular kind of angel. Artistically, you can see here, this is coming all the way back to a first century painting, wall painting in Pompeii, of the pagan goddess Venus, her husband, or lover anyway, Mars, not husband, lover. Husband is Hephaestus, I guess, or Vulcan, I guess, in Roman. So Mars, and then their son, Cupid. And so you can kind of see there, the little Cupid is always this little guy, and he's got wings. So there's a pretty direct line between the modern cherub pictures, actually, and the ancient Cupid. And actually, Cupid also there's multiple little Cupids that he'd run around with. There were a bunch of other different gods in the Greek and Roman pantheon that are winged, depicted as winged. And this is especially true, for example, all the winds. So in ancient Greek and Roman sort of geography and physical sense, there's this idea that the world is surrounded by these cardinal directions, and each one of them has a wind: the north wind, the south wind, the west wind, the east wind. And so these are personified. This particular pot here is showing Boreas, who's the north wind. You might have even heard the Zephyrus is the name of the west wind, because that tends to get used as a name. My high school newspaper was called the Zephyrus because my high school was Edina West High School, and so because it was the West is in our title, they called it the Zephyrus. Anyway, another example of the winds, in other words, are shown as gods with wings in pagan depictions, Greco-Roman paganism. Another one is the goddess Iris, who was personified as the rainbow, so she's one of the messengers of the Olympian gods. She also had wings and to get around and give her message to, God's messages to humans. And really this idea of winged heavenly messengers, you can see that there's a direct correlation with the idea of angel, which has the same kind of meaning. Angelic roles. So we mentioned here the winds. Just as they had been in pagan antiquity, natural forces were frequently anthropomorphized in the Middle Ages. So this is a medieval depiction of the winds. And so we have those different cold north and south and east and west winds, depending. And they're all, up in the heavens, and they're blowing down on everybody, in these kind of cardinal directions. But now they're all depicted as not as gods, but they're angels, right? So it's different because they're no longer pagans, but they still have a lot of pagan past that they're still inheriting, especially when they're dealing with natural science. So coming back to modern times and modern depictions. So although some of the imagery then and roles given to angels have their roots in the gods of Greek and Roman paganism, popular culture also frequently associates angels with people who were let's say, in Christian context, good Christians who die and go to heaven, and now they're coming back, they're being sent back down to earth to be guardian angels and things like that, and they have that job. And so this movie, It's a Wonderful Life, which is a Christmas classic, and my family, we have to watch it every year, or get to watch it every year. And one of the ideas is that there's Clarence, who is an angel second class for the last 200 years, I guess, since his own earth life has been sent to Earth to try to earn his wings by doing good deeds and helping out people like George Bailey here. And so, anyway, he's still, working on becoming an angel first class, and then therefore getting his wings. And in the movie, they create, I think, the aphorism that every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings, which I don't think that existed before the movie. But anyway, maybe it may or may not have. So anyway, this is an idea then of angels being associated with people who once were alive, so humans. And that, for example, that popular idea has continued, for example, in Mormonism. So the idea that angels are the spirits of people who lived in a past mortal life is actually very, very different from the traditional teaching in Judaism, Christianity, and in Islam. But it is precisely this understanding that Joseph Smith, who's the prophet who founded Mormonism, when he identified an angel who showed him the golden plates from which he composed the Book of Mormon, the angel identified himself as a guy named Moroni who had lived in ancient times in the Americas. And so, in other words, it's not a separate kind of spiritual being, but rather the spirit of someone who's deceased, or possibly somebody who has already been resurrected, depending on how it's understood. And then that's the same depicted on the Mormon temples, if you've seen Moroni with the horn. Moroni, actually, properly, all angels have attributes, and properly, Moroni is supposed to be holding gold plates. And if you go to New York here in the Hill Cumorah, there's a big column, and on top of it is a Moroni, a golden Moroni, and then he's holding the gold plates. As opposed to this, the way this happened is completely by mistake. So the original the Mormon temple in Nauvoo had an angel Gabriel with a horn, because Gabriel's attribute is the horn. And when they moved to Salt Lake, they'd forgotten that it was Gabriel that had the horn, and they made a Moroni angel and they gave him a horn. So it's an accidental mistake there. So anyway, we'll just to go down that rat hole a little further, this is just a side note here, but it's kind of interesting. So Mormon doctrine went on to further identify then the named angels that are actually in the biblical text with the idea that those are humans. And so Michael, who is the angel in the book of Revelations, the leader of the host of heaven, he then in earth life becomes Adam. And so those are one and the same. Michael is the pre-existent Adam, and then also after Adam dies, the post-existent Adam. And likewise, Gabriel, so the angel that, for example, is in the Gospel of Daniel, the book of Daniel, and also the Gospel of Luke, comes to earth as Noah. So that's, anyway, the Mormon understanding of this, but totally different from regular Christians and Jews or Muslims. Okay, so another, going back to that popular conception, so we talked about in It's a Wonderful Life, this role of guardian angels. And so whatever the nature, one of the bigger roles angels retain in popular culture is this individual or personal guardian spirits. And so this is like a postcard from a whole series of guardian angel postcards from a century ago. And as you can kind of see, anyway, this conception of, back in the day, even still when I was a kid, they used to let kids run around unsupervised, and this is not happening anymore. But apparently, like as little kids would run off and play around cliffs, the idea was hopefully a guardian angel is preventing them from falling to their deaths, and that's pretty much the only thing that was, because we have so much more safety and that kind of thing now. So anyway, the idea of guardian angels. And finally, another very common picture and thought and metaphor that people have about these angels are the little angel that's on your shoulder, right? And so there's the little angels. The little angel and the little devil actually usually look like the person whose shoulder they're on, because they're also a personification of, I think, the internal debate that we have between, essentially, as we're trying to pick between two different motivations. And we perceive there's an internal dialogue in our decision making, whether or not that's the case. And so then we kind of perceive those as essentially our very negative impulses and our conscience, and our positive impulses and how we listen to them in that decision making. And interestingly, anyway, that gets used a lot. so it's obviously used in political discourse. Little ponies have angels and devils on. The Spider-Verse, for some reason, ancient Incas, so in other words, so it's like, this is like a Disney movie, and that even though, anyway, I think it's set in ancient, I think it's called The Emperor's New Groove, and I think it's actually set in like ancient Incas or whatever. For some reason, they have angels and devils anyway. So it's just so universal that it doesn't matter if it's a completely explicitly non-Christian context even to have them. And this was kind of interesting, I think. That's very meta, which is to say, so in the same sense that we all have this internal decision-making dialogue, then the angel himself then is taking it one step further, consulting with his good angel or whatever.
He's got a deaf one.
Remind me of Elephants All the Way.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be turtles all the way down,
Turtles
right?
all the way.
This would be like an infinite reduction. So this is very frequently used, though. It's not only the Spider-Verse and My Little Ponies. It's really all over the place. Those are just a quick Google search. Okay. So in contrast to some of these popular ideas and Mormon teaching, traditional Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all view angels as spiritual beings created by God apart from humanity. So they are not spirits of deceased humans or preborn humans or anything like that, but rather their own order of spiritual creatures. And just as a description of that in the Psalms, Psalm 8, it says, "You, God, have made him," mankind, that is to say, "a little less than the angels." So there's orders of created beings, and then in fact, actually, in the traditional sense, actually an entire just amazing array of angel hierarchy. So like 10, 12, 24 classes of angels. Elizabeth has a comment. And then humans are right underneath.
Notice in the picture, the cherub has 6 wings, which is traditional.
So there we go. Yeah. So there's a 6-winged. So again, not always a human body. With there's actually all kinds of different cherubs. So in this case, a cherubim, where in fact you can also see all the eyes, right? So they're also all-seeing. So it's represented, all of this kind of. Anyway, 6-winged. And then there's there's a bunch of different ones. So for example, in the Ezekiel, there's the angels that are in the form of a bird, or rather an eagle, a ox, a human, and a lion. And those then are carried over. I think they're in Daniel. They're also in the book of Revelation for Christians. And so for Christians, they're actually also in. I've seen them in Islamic art. Those same four imagery, and they're essentially the throne holders of the throne of God, and they are in the Christian identification. They become the 4 evangelists, so they represent the 4 Christian gospels for Christians, and so this is why, for example, like Saint Mark is the winged lion, and so that's why if you go to Venice, there's winged lions all over the place because the Venetians stole Saint Mark's body. Okay, so just even to look at some of the roots of this, we have done, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here, but we have looked at, as we've looked at the kind of history of the Bible and the development of the Bible and also the development of ancient Judaism up through the First Temple period and the Second Temple period to modern Rabbinic Judaism and also Christianity, that the earliest components of it, for example, in this case in Genesis, there's this idea that Jacob, the patriarch whose name becomes Israel, he's wrestling with somebody. In the story it says, as we have it now, it says he wrestles with a man, and other places in the Bible it refers to him wrestling with the angel. But what he actually says is, when he names the place, he says, "I call this place Peniel, and it's because I have seen God face to face." And so it's maybe referring to then an earlier version of the story, since he's making that declaration that he makes, or that quotation, doesn't get changed. And so what he's possibly doing here, where scholars see, is that perhaps he's actually wrestling with God. But it gets watered down because of, as the conception changes, as as later prophets no longer think of God as having a body and can wrestle with people and this kind of a thing, it gets edited out. And so anyway, so there's many different examples like that, and Leandro has had several lectures on this idea that there's this ancient Jewish ideas about their God, about Yahweh, evolve as they start to understand that God is not being just solely a national God that is sort of like the other gods around them, but is rather the God, that God is God, with a capital G. And so with that idea then of monotheism, as that develops, as people are more and more committed to that, we have now, instead of a guy who this is still anthropomorphized in this picture, right? But instead of having a God who is at the scale that perhaps a human could wrestle with, we now have a God who's like holding up the planets, right, and all of the celestial spheres, and is causing that. So there's quite a different scale. And so as that, we've seen before, that earliest sources, the J source, the God of Israel is much more like these kind of polytheist gods that contemporaries have, like the Greeks and Romans. And it's often anthropomorphized with companions who are sometimes called the sons of El. And Leandro's brought up several of those where when one of the verses that still remains in the Bible is when El is holding his council and dividing all the peoples of the world, his part that he gives to Yahweh is the Israel, right? And he gives the Moabites to Chemosh, and so on and so forth. And some of those same ideas then continue on as the sort of divine companions that, for example, are existing in like the heavenly court as described in the book of Job, where people who beings which might have originally been gods are now demoted to being angels, and they're part of an angelic court. And so then essentially all of the former gods that continue to be in the story are sort of cosmologically demoted. They're no longer divine, but they are spiritual beings that are creations of God. So one of the consequences is as God gets more and more remote, more and more cosmic, as the scale, the idea of God increases, God ceases to be depicted, for example. We still have sometimes they'll do this thing with the hand reaching down or something like that. But anyway, it goes from something that's like a human scale that you can wrestle with, somebody like a divine king, somebody like Zeus, into the invisible, the incomprehensible, the infinite. Regular everyday people, theologians like that kind of thing and those kind of words. Regular everyday people often want some kind of intermediary, so they want some kind of way that we can envision or speak to or comprehend, a connection to the divine. And there's all kinds of different ways that that's been accomplished theologically, but one of them is that these, for example, biblically, what may have been gods, like the angel of death or the angel of the hosts of heaven, or any number that may have originally been gods in their own right, have now been demoted down to angel status. And so then from there, that idea of what an angel is gets developed, especially in that Second Temple period of Judaism. So people now start to have much radically expanded ideas of what angels are and all the levels of angels and all the names of angels. And almost none of this writing makes it into the actual canonical Bible, but just a couple examples of it. We mentioned essentially the named angels, Michael and Gabriel, and then also in the Septuagint, in the Apocrypha, Raphael. And so those ones get to be the named angels. Then there's a whole bunch more named angels like Metatron and everybody like that, but they're primarily in books like the Book of Enoch, so books that did not make it in. Okay. So part of that's happening in that time period. So when people are looking back to the earliest prophets, people like Moses, while they were maybe seemingly, it was comfortable for the writers of those prophetic books to show Moses talking to God directly. In the second period, angels act as God's messenger. And so, for example, Gabriel appears to Daniel and gives Daniel God's vision, as an intermediary. And in the last book, Daniel's by far the last book of the Hebrew Bible to actually get written down and composed. And likewise then, about 2 centuries later, when the Christian New Testament is being written, the Gospel of Luke also then makes use of that same angel Gabriel in order to bring revelation to both Zechariah and also to Mary, Jesus' mother. And the same angel, Jibril, is the messenger who appears to the Prophet Muhammad in Islam. So now let's switch back to scholasticism. So we talked about how we don't actually have the question, how many angels can sit on the head of a pin in medieval philosophy and medieval theology. But that doesn't mean that medieval philosophers did talk about angels. And so what we're going to try to do, instead of just dismissing this talk as being totally abstruse and not relevant to anything, instead I want to actually just go for it and go right into Anselm of Canterbury and one of his more complicated arguments about angels, and then you can all decide for yourself whether, okay, yeah, I do think that this is really abstruse, or you can also decide whether this is still being able to be used as a starting point for discussions that still are meaningful now. Okay, so we know Anselm. We've had a lecture on Anselm of Bec before. He becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, so he's kind of one of a rare philosopher who also ends up having a very important political position. So he's the head of the Church of England under the time periods of the right after the Norman Conquest. So William II, William Rufus, who is one of the great gay kings of England, who absolutely did not like the church, and so he was at war with Anselm, the entire time, and kicked him out of England and wouldn't let him come back and all this kind of thing. And then his successor, because he didn't have any kids, his brother, Henry I, who also ended up having a big long fight with Anselm over questions of church and state and power of the king over the bishopric. Anyway, so Anselm, our lecture that we had before, we had on what's called the ontological argument for God. So Anselm, in his theology, he defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So he said, okay, what is God? And so that's Anselm's definition, which you can see is different maybe from, let's say, the average Christian in the pews or anybody in Abrahamic religion probably in standard popular worship. But this is one of the leading medieval theologians' view. And from that, he is building on earlier ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, things from Plato, Aristotle, and beyond, that are equating God with the good or the one of Platonism and Neoplatonism, and also with the unmoved mover, the source of all of motion in the cosmos that we were talking about. And Anselm, in his ontological argument, believed he philosophically could prove God's existence, and also in the simplest possible argument. However, people have not necessarily all been convinced ever since, So we've talked about that. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about these kind of logical questions, and especially as operating at Anselm's time, we've mentioned a little bit before, medieval philosophers are more excited about logic probably than anybody at any time in philosophy before or since. So even more so than ancient people or modern people, and especially then from Anselm, who we have, through Abelard, who's that famous medieval theologian who gets in trouble for seducing his student Eloise and then having her uncle castrate him, and so anyway, and he got in trouble later for all kinds of other different reasons. But anyway, he's a central brilliant thinker in the Christian West, and then down to Aquinas, who we've also talked about, Thomas Aquinas. They're very focused on logic. And indeed, logic is the central curriculum in the medieval universities. It's one of the core focuses of the 7 liberal arts. logic is one of the seven, the third of the trivium. So they were using logic to treat questions like this. Okay, if we are given this idea, so you don't have to believe in God, but let's just take that if you do. And one of the definitions of God is that God is omnipotent. And one of the things that people in Abrahamic religions frequently say is that, well, God can all things are possible with God. God can do anything, right? And they're omnipotent as a quality. So the question, one of the standard trope questions then is, can God create a rock that is so heavy that God couldn't even lift it?
How could this be possible?
How could that? So Elizabeth says, how could that be possible? Well, God could do anything, right?
Yeah.
So God can create a rock that would be too big for God to lift? No. So we like the first part of it. God can do anything, but then it starts getting to the point where then there seems like a paradox, right?
Yeah.
So this is not a paradox as far as people like Anselm are concerned. It may be a paradox for later thinkers, because later thinkers in the West, anyway, get much more concerned about emphasizing God's will and God's omnipotence and not putting any kind of limitations. But for Anselm, this is not a paradox. So Anselm, his answer is God can't do that. And you might go, what? God can't do something? But it's not a limitation of God because we might ask, because Anselm says that God's omnipotence means that he can lift any rock. That's the part of the idea of omnipotence. It's not possible to have a rock that's too heavy for an omnipotent being to do. And God is therefore limited, as far as Anselm's concerned, in not being able to do things that are not possible. So if things are not actually possible, God can't do those things. And so that may not be where everybody lands eventually, but in the central Middle Ages, the theologians are quite clear on that. It's essential that they like logic, and one of the things that logic has at its core is non-contradiction. So A can't equal not A. So God can't make A equal not A. God can't make, as far as Anselm is concerned, he can't make a triangle that has 4 sides, because a triangle by definition has 3. So there could have been a different definition somewhere at the beginning of all this, but now we're at a place where that's what triangles are, and you can't do it any other way, because it's not logically possible. So this is where they're at in terms of using logic, on the one hand for theology, but on the other hand for philosophy. Okay, so one of the things that angels, so we've talked about all these different ways that angels are used popularly now or understood popularly now, but one of the things that was important to medieval thinkers is exploring logical possibilities, using the idea of angels in thought experiments to explore questions. So, for example, the question of free will and determinism, and the question of the problem of evil. So these are still, at least the free will and determinism is still a very strong operating question up to the present day. If you have been in college and, I don't know, smoked pot, even without it, whether you did or not, whether you inhaled or not, the whether everything is all determined or whether we have individual free will, whether we're simply a product of our genes and our environment and everything that we do is automatic based on those kind of things, or whether we're somehow exercising free will and how does that work, is the kind of topic that is still operative. And in terms of the problem of evil, that continues to be obviously a very important issue for people who are theists. So the problem of evil is, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good, why is there so much evil in the world, which has to somehow, doesn't have to somehow be God's responsibility for creating all of that, since God has created everything, right? So, and I think I wrote that just now, yeah. So isn't God responsible for making the people who make the bad choices that result in all of these horrible consequences? And so that's one of the ways that, the problem of evil anyway continues to be relevant for people who are theists. And I'd argue it is still relevant for people who are not theists, in the sense of, if you would like for there to be such a thing as good, If you think that everything's relative and there's not particularly anything that is good, or if we want to say, for example, there's not really a thing about that humans aren't really necessarily a thing, it's an arbitrary convention that we have. If at a certain point when we go down that relativist path, we can't say, for example, that there are any fundamental human rights, or that it's necessarily, we don't have a basis for saying any particular thing is good or evil in terms of what you might do. Maybe. And so in those questions then, if we would like to instead say that there is some kind of a good and that doing such and such a thing is good, we still then have to account for, anyway, evil, and how that all works, right? So Anselm has a big, long argument about this, and we cannot go through the whole thing. But I just want to kind of delve into it so that we can kind of see how all of this logic works out. And so he has a treatise called On the Fall of the Devil, and it is created as a dialogue that is between a student and a teacher. The teacher is pretty much Anselm, and one of his students. And so you can almost imagine how things were, what it would have been like to live in the monastery of Bec, where Anselm was from, or the monastery of Canterbury, where he ended up, the cathedral school in Canterbury, as people are using this kind of disputation, this kind of dialogue in order to go back and forth in kind of medieval teaching. And so we'll look at how this kind of goes. So the fall of the devil. So this is a thought experiment, again, about angels, because in the traditional conception in Christianity, the devil is a fallen angel, right? So there are, prior to people being created and being on the earth, the angels are in heaven, and they're all undifferentiated in terms of they were all together as angels. And at some point or other, there's a war in heaven, and half the angel, or a third of the angels, including their leader, Lucifer, who becomes Satan, rebel against God for some reason and fall, and they become the devils and demons, or the jinn. These are in Christianity anyway, the devil and all of his demons, right? And so essentially this is a question of how do you go from being an angel created by God in the court of heaven to the devil. So here's the student. Does the phrase from St. Paul, what do you have that you have not received, apply only to humans, or does that apply to angels as well? So what do you have that you haven't received? So Paul's kind of saying more or less here that every single thing that you have in your life, you've gotten, and God is ultimately the person God is ultimately where everything comes from, right? So the source of all, right? And so the teacher replies, so this is like a basic example, and angels here is not only important for the question of how this applies to angels, but rather, again, as a thought experiment based on just trying to understand how the decision-making works. And so angels here are being used in a kind of a theoretical or philosophical sense. So the teacher replies here, no creature has anything of itself. So no creation, that means. It's not talking about the creator, because the creator is not a creature, everything else is a creature, right? How can something that does not have being of itself have anything of itself? So that's already, we're already now wading deep into medieval understanding, medieval philosophy, but the idea here is that none of us as beings intrinsically have created that being, or we're not self-created in terms of our being and our existence. Rather, everything that we have in terms of being has some cause that caused us to be what we are at, right? And so since we are not our own first cause, we therefore can't have anything of ourselves because we are not the cause of ourselves, right? So in short, if there's only one who creates, and whatever is created is from that one, which is essentially the premise here that there's some prime mover that is the source of all of this creation, and everything is ultimately from that original source, it is clear that he who creates and what he has created is all there is. So then the student, like a good person just talking to Socrates, says, "That's clear. I'm with you, Socrates." So Anselm in this case, though. So then the teacher says, also the creator himself and what has been creator can only be from that same creator. So essentially the first mover, the source of all the creation, the source of movement, the source of being is itself from itself, right? Or from himself. Okay. So, right, this is kind of how they're launching into this. So that's stuff that he's already talked about in previous things. So this is just kind of what we understand that we've already proved, as far as Anselm is concerned, that understanding of God. So now we're coming to this talking about angels and free will and things like that. But as the next proviso, he warns us here, take care not to think, since we read in Scripture, or say in quoting it, that God causes evil or not being. So if I'm reading around in Scripture and I see this thing where it sure sounds like as I'm reading Scripture that God has certainly caused some kind of an evil, it says it a lot of times in the Bible that God causes some sort of evil thing to happen or something like that, or suffering. So he's saying here evil or non-being, so he's actually introducing into this what he's going to ultimately talk about what evil is. But anyway, let's skip over that because the Bible doesn't necessarily talk as much overtly about non-being. That he thinks not, if we read that in Scripture, that I am criticizing or denying what is said there. So I'm not criticizing Scripture and I'm not denying that Scripture can be read that way. But at that same time, guys, in reading Scripture, we ought not to attend so much to the impropriety of the words that cover a truth as pay attention to the propriety of the truth that is hidden under the various kinds of verbal expression. So what the medieval Christian theologians here are very clear about is just because the Bible says something, and we should not take it literally ever, under any circumstances. Because what we should understand is that there is actual truth that we can read underneath the text. And so as opposed to modern scriptural literalists, for example, which is kind of where things have come in a lot of different cases, anyway, the doctors of philosophy and theology in the Middle Ages think quite the opposite. Okay, and the student, just to bring the point home about not reading scripture literally, the student says, to do what you suggest would occur only to someone stupid or desirous of cavilling over scripture. So if you want to just nitpick and all those kind of things about scripture and literalism and things like that, then, anyway, you shouldn't even be talking to the philosophers. Teacher's pet for me. Yeah, the teacher's pet. So yeah, definitely Anselm likes the student. Okay. However, the student is a smart student, and he really hits Anselm over the head with it. So let's just see what he says. So he said, okay, so here we go, teacher, Anselm. The student says, if the angels have everything they have from God, so God is the cause of everything, as we've already taken that as a given, it follows that the angel who perseveres in truth does so because he has perseverance. And he that has that because he received it. So the persevering angels, they have perseverance. They have that perseverance because they received it. And he received it because God gave it to him. So that makes all the sense of the world. We can, no problem, usually when we're dealing with the problem of evil, of explaining good. So it also follows, and he quotes scripture here again, this quotation is from the Gospel of John, it also follows that he who does not persevere in the truth does not persevere because he does not have perseverance. And he does not have it because God did not give it to him. So tell me what his fault is, seeing that he did not persevere because he was not given perseverance, without which gift he could do nothing. I am in fact certain, unless I misunderstand, that the devil could only be justly damned by him who is supremely just, and could not be justly damned if the fault was not his, right? So we have all of these angels, and God's created all of these angels, And some of them persevere in the truth, and those continue to be Gabriel and Michael and Uriel and Raphael and all those guys. And then some of them, Satan and Beelzebub and all these other guys, end up not persevering. And so how could they have done that unless they didn't get perseverance from God? So it's a pretty tough question the student asks. So the devil's understood, as we say in this exercise, then to be a fallen angel. God gave him all these qualities. Isn't God responsible for making him the way he turned out? And if so, how can it be just for God to damn Lucifer, right? And so I'm going to suggest that in this question, this formulation of this question, this is actually also still kind of a question that's operative for us today if we increasingly understand ourselves, for example, to be products of our genes and then our environment. And so we think, the reason why people do any particular thing can possibly be traced to all sorts of factors that are socioeconomic, that are abuse as a child, that are any number of different things that can happen. If so, to what extent is any individual who then does something, commits a crime or something like that, responsible for their crime, or to what extent do they have some sort of let's say it could be a mental condition that was brought on through some kind of either genetic or environmental role. And so in those senses, where is it necessarily just in different crime theories that we have in different punishment theories, sometimes punishment for crimes is retributive, where we're essentially trying to punish people, and is that ever just, or or do we have to then have a theory of justice which is promoting, let's say, something else like public safety? The person is too dangerous to be running around, and so the only thing that we're actually doing is cordoning them off. Or maybe it's rehabilitative if there's some way that factor can be done to undo these things that went into it, right? So anyway, I think that this is still an operative question. So the student goes on, and there's a lot more arguments, back and forth. Okay, so if the good angel received perseverance because God gave it to him, and then the bad angel did not receive it because God did not give it to him. So that's kind of where they've gotten to, right? So the teacher says, though, okay, that doesn't follow logically. And so, again, these guys love logic. So it can be the case that something's not being received is not explained by the fact that it was not given, even though giving is always the cause of receiving. So if you do receive something, for sure, there had to have been giving as the cause. But you can have not receiving even if they're still given. Right, is essentially what he's saying logically. So the student says, that goes on for a long time now. I skipped ... Anyway, so the student says, okay, if you want to say that God did not give him the gift of perseverance because he did not receive it. So in other words, so God is giving to everybody, but only the one angel actually took it up and received it, right? And the other ones didn't. So they didn't receive the perseverance even though it was given to all. I ask you, why didn't he take it? So why did that angel then not take what is being given? Either it's because he didn't have the capacity to take it, so the taking capacity, which is again going to be God's fault, because he did not, or because he did not want it. So let's just say or because he did not want it. If he did not have the capacity or the will to take it, God did not give it to him. So again, it's only as far as the student's concerned, Anselm has only kicked the can down the the pie, whatever you want to say logically. Okay, so we can't read the entire essay, because it would be a lot more and more and more like that. So I'm going to give you guys kind of like the crib note here as Mary here is punching the devil in the illuminated manuscript. So Anselm's Theodicy, so theodicy is the way we try to, theologians try to give an answer to the problem of evil. So Anselm gets God off the hook through what's essentially the Platonist definition of evil. So in the same sense that darkness doesn't have actual existence or essence, darkness is merely absence of light. In that same way, evil is merely a lack of good, as far as Plato and Augustine and Boethius and everybody down to Anselm, including Aquinas, are concerned. And so there isn't some kind of a competing force, as in Zoroastrian dualism, where evil is a force that's diametrically opposed to good. Rather, evil is simply lack of good. So, comment. Yes. Where did the mic? Erjan is not here for the mic. Oh, appreciate it. Thank you.
So quickly, the Islamic version of that. First of all, angels are not given free will, so they just obey.
Yes.
So therefore, Satan and his group are not fallen angels. They're just a third group.
Oh, okay.
Human beings are given free will. And that's synonymous with saying God gave them that gift, but they chose not to get it. So it specifically says in the Quran that humans are given free will, and human nature is good.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
But a person chooses through free will whether to practice that or not. And by good, that doesn't mean becoming a Muslim.
Yes.
By good meanings the universal being either a good Muslim or a good Jew or a good Buddhist or a good Hindu.
Yeah.
So that's
I like that.
That version. Okay.
Yeah. So in that sense, it's actually, that part's not all that different. You don't have to turn it off. He turns it off over there. Which is to say, the idea here actually is going to be that everything created is good. And so even at the end of the day, everything that has being, so being itself is, the source of all being is the one, the being, God, the creator. And so anything that is having being, which is to say existence at all, is ultimately good at some level, including the devil. So just in the participating in existence, they have a little, even the devil has a little bit of good in him, according to essentially this theological position by Anselm. I'm interested, though, in this question. So if angels don't have, so Anselm is very clear on this too in terms of angels not having free will. They don't have free will anymore, as far as Anselm's concerned in this, but they all had free will until this moment happened. Before, when some of them went good and some of them went evil, and now neither of them have free will, because they essentially, they're like a being that is like a computer that has only read-write memory, and as soon as it flipped over, its programming is that, and there's no more free will. It chose the path and it did it. And so my question is, how do you get away from, if God is simply creating Satan and the jinn or whatever, and they're all their own separate thing that are not fallen angels, how do you get away from the problem of evil there, where God has created bad beings? Well, so I think we have it right here, right? Okay, yeah. So we're getting on. We're anticipating where this is going. So, okay. So for Anselm, so we have this idea: God is creating all being, right? So everything that is being is from God, and so God creates and actually also has to sustain being. So as far as Anselm and actually also other medieval Christian theologians like Aquinas, anything that is having being is getting that being from God in an ongoing, sustaining way. And so that's all from God. That said, then, if, though, God ceases to sustain your being, even if in the Bible it says you destroyed somebody, he hasn't caused your non-being as far as Anselm is concerned, because you already had non-being. Which is to say, non-being is what you start with. And Anselm's argument is that God is giving, when in this active potential of creation and sustaining, creating being, God is essentially giving being, and simply ceasing to give being at some point or other is not causing non-being. The non-being was already there. And so he had a bunch of different analogies that he uses in this argument. So one of them is, if you loaned a guy who is naked your cloak, and then at some point or other you take your cloak back, you didn't make him naked. He was already naked as his condition. You just ceased giving him a cloak. and so that's and one of the arguments. Another one he has is, if I want to give you the gift of a song that I've written, and I'm going to all not give you a gift of a song. You're very lucky today. but you would only be having that gift as long as I keep singing. But as soon as I stop, then you wouldn't have that gift anymore. But it's not that it's not that the non-singing that you were already experiencing is my fault. It's that you already had that. so this is now whether or not we agree with him on this one, because this can be. Are you off the hook really for this kind of stuff? Because in some sense, if you were, for example, as a parent, this is not one of the arguments that Anselm makes. As a parent, if you're responsible, for feeding your kids, and you are feeding them every day and everything like that, and then at some day or other you stop feeding them, are you not responsible for the not feeding? They already had not feeding. That was what they started with. Then you kind of created a system where you were feeding them, and now you stopped feeding them. So in other words, are you off the hook for that? So I don't know. This is so this is anyway where he comes to off in terms of how he understands this idea of being and non-being, good, evil, light, and darkness. So since evil though is nothing. So in the angels, when we're getting to the point where the angels are making that binary decision and getting their circuitry written, Anselm argued that the pre-fallen angel's actual choice is not between good and evil, but actually between two positive motivations. And so he's trying to come up with it's not that God is putting in the angels the propensity to good or evil, since evil isn't anything anyway. Rather, there are two different motivations or two different desires. The desire for justice, which Anselm defines as preservation of rectitude, which is to say, so that you're going to have right behavior, you're going to be obedient, and this I think. And then the other one is a desire for happiness, which he defines as self-interest. And so this part is not very different from the Iblis story that we have in Quran, which is essentially the angels are there, they have this capacity, maybe anyway, at least that's not part of the story, but if whether they all choose to bow down or not, if the bowing down then is rectitude, in other words, you've obeyed God and done what God told you to, and then if the one who doesn't bow down, it's because he thinks, where does it in my self-interest? How am I going to be happy by worshiping, this creation of gods or something like that? I only want to worship God or whatever it is. So this is under those circumstances, you've put your own self-interest or your desire for happiness above your desire for justice. And when that happened, then the angels, they all did so because they chose that latter desire when it was in conflict with the former desire. Anselm doesn't have a story like the one we just took from Quran of when this happened or what was going on. He just is anticipating that these were the two motivations that the angels would have been, let's say, pre-programmed with as a creation of God's, and that at a certain moment they more or less independently made their decision whether they were picking rectitude or whether they were picking happiness, justice or happiness. And the ones that picked justice now no longer have any capacity to ever pick self-interest or happiness, because all of them know with perfect knowledge of what happened to the angels that fell. And so you'd have to be nuts, to be able to pick that now. And so they can't. So they can only now pick justice and rectitude. That's what they pick every single time. And so they no longer have free will. Likewise, all the fallen angels can no longer do the opposite either. So they are also locked in now to their path. And so angels no longer have free will as far as the theology here is concerned, the philosophy. Okay, so even through all of that, though, it's still in a way a question of what's the actual mechanism. So why do you end up choosing self-interest? Even if you have those two motivations that are inborn, why are you choosing self-interest or happiness over justice? So student asks, why did he will what he ought not? So, why, if he has that free will or whatever, why did he will the thing that he shouldn't have willed? And Anselm's answer to this one is, no cause preceded this will except that he was able to will. So it's essentially, he has the will, he can do either way, he has that free will, there is no cause that is causing that anymore. And so the student's like, well, then why did he will it? Simply because he willed it. For there was no other cause by which his will was in any way incited or attracted. Instead, his will was its own efficient cause. So he had the capacity to will. There isn't anything that's setting him one way or the other. Anselm is not committing to himself here to he flipped a coin or he was tempted in any other kind of way. In other words, there is some of the angels did the one, some of the angels did the other. They had that will to do it, and that's what happened. And so it still sort of leaves open this very difficult question of the mechanism of free will whenever anybody wants to argue in favor of free will, which most of us do want to believe there's some kind of free will. So how do we actually make the decisions we make, or do we just think we're making these decisions? What's the mechanism that causes us to pick any one particular path? And so you might say, when in terms of why do I do any particular thing? I have like a range of things that I'm likely to do, in any given set of circumstances, and there's maybe I'm more likely, one morning I'm very likely every morning to drink coffee while I'm reading newspapers online. I'm relatively unlikely to have a donut with them, but sometimes, once every 3 weeks or so for some reason, or, whatever it is, there's all kinds of different factors that maybe go into why, I'm feeling that particular morning and why that thing is happening. But for any kind of thing like that, is there a point at a certain point where there's like a 50-50 chance that I might do the one thing and I might do the other thing, and is there an internal coin toss that's happening there? Or is there a thing where I did the thing because, in any given sense, I was 51% more likely to do that, and that's why I did it. And if not that, what's the mechanism that actually has caused me to make the one choice as opposed to the other choice, right? So free will is when you open up the brain and get in there, it's a very complicated thing. And one of the things that we end up finding, in let's say modern science with a lot of this, is that all kinds of different things, when we make a decision, some of the, if you have a yes response or a no response, some of those register in your face and biologically, and they register sometimes before we are ourselves aware of consciously making that yes or no decision. It's not easy to test for that, but anyway, in different studies like that. So is there a sense that, is it possible then that even though we have a strong sense that we are making all these decisions, is it also possible that that's an illusion that we have within ourselves? So, in that sense, this metaphor, I think, actually, has sort of ongoing relevance. This is one of the reasons why it continues to be present in our culture. Because we still are considering and thinking about our internal dialogue, our internal decision-making process as we think about why we behave any of the particular ways that we behave. And I just want to say, just as a diversion here, as a kind of a left curve here at the end. So obviously we don't talk anywhere near as much. We don't use angels in our thought experiments about free will and things like that as much as we, say, people in the Middle Ages did logically. But for some of these kinds of thought experiments that we have, there's a bunch of different ways that we approach these in literature and TV. And as a fan of science fiction, for example, one of the ways that people explore kinds of thought experiments about free will and determinism, for example, is through things like Star Trek, right? And time travel. If you've been watching Star Trek, there's a new Star Trek show on. Not everybody sees all the shows anymore, but anyway, this whole season's about a figure, coincidentally, called the Red Angel, who is a time traveler. And in all of the questions that happen in science fiction about time travel, there is the question of free will and determination is almost always brought up, because essentially when you go back in time as a time traveler, what ends up happening paradoxically. So are you in one of these stories where the fact that you went back in time, the past is already written, and so you were actually destined essentially to go back in time and make all of those changes, even if, let's say, you end up being your own grandfather or whatever it is, did that already happen and you actually haven't changed anything because, in fact, the timeline had to have that incursion happen because in the past you did appear at that time and that has caused all the events to go forward? Or is it the opposite? Is it like the grandfather paradox when you go back, you have all these things, your grandparents meet, they have their wonderful dinner and night out, they get married, and ultimately you're born, you invent a time machine, you go back in time, you meet your grandfather, you screw up their date, and then suddenly they never meet, you genetically, you actually only have to make, anything you do in the past is going to change absolutely all of history because the chances that any particular individual is conceived is crazy because of the amount of different sperm involved, right? So one little jiggle to all of human history changes all of the players, right? None of us would exist at all with anything happening at all in the past. One micro change and every person doesn't ever exist because you would all get like a slightly different person or whatever, even if it's, anyway, the conceptions all would all happen differently. Anyway, so it doesn't take very much. But that would be, in other words, anyway, it's a way to understand, okay, if the universe is open to all of these kind of changes, how is that possible too? Because you can never have made the time machine once you changed it, right? So if it's not as it was written if you were to time travel. So, as we've seen in whatever in the Planet of the Apes, you destroyed it all, and so essentially this is a grandfather paradox because what ends up happening after 8 movies is it's the apes that go back in time and they themselves are their own grandfather paradox, right? So, yeah. Well, I would just say in terms of some of the wilder Armageddon things like supernova and stuff like that is that also in the odds. In terms of geologic time and everything like that we've already gone through, the random moment that we've actually gotten space travel, if in that blink of an eye, in terms of human time, that we then have some kind of really big, it's also quite low odds that we get taken out by a supernova at that exact moment. But that sense, though, one of the things that had continually happened, let's say all the way through from the end of the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, was this idea of taking the Earth out of the center of the cosmos. The Earth is now going around the center, which is the sun. So the sun is the center of the universe. Then the sun is not the center of the universe. It's just off in the side of a galaxy. The galaxy is just one of just an amazing number of galaxies in a cluster that's an amazing number of clusters, and the universe becomes so phenomenally big that it also has seemed like it has made, let's say, humanity like crazily less important, throughout most of that then modern times, but then on the other hand, when you reverse engineer the equation the other way, about how unlikely all of these conditions are that bring it all up, it kind of reverses it to when we get to the point where humans are operating at this high information level that life is actually operating at, in terms of chemical processes over and above, let's say, what normal physics is doing, that there is something pretty amazing happening, and that we can, as we now have gotten to this other end of science, we are now, I think, re-looking at what's going on in terms of the evolution of ideas and things like that we can kind of, again, we don't have to get too self-righteous as humans, but we can be a little bit, being a little bit less, not totally knocked off this pedestal that that we've been experiencing for 500 years. So.
Yeah, just so one of these factors, that led to the present type of life that we have here, I've always thought was kind of a very sort of a ego deflating idea, and that is that the first forms of unicellular life were anaerobic bacteria. They existed outside of the presence of oxygen,
right?
And oxygen was their waste byproduct,
right?
And there developed so many anaerobic bacteria that basically they toxified their own environment,
right?
And it was kind of the first
climate
catastrophe, life caused climate,
yeah,
and so. Most of them perished, except for the very few bacteria that were able to mutate to withstand this poison, which was oxygen.
Right.
And so we're the result of all of that. And the few anaerobic bacteria that are still around are, like, for instance, botulism, which is an anaerobic bacteria. So we kind of came from, what was kind of a great big garbage heap, basically.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Very interesting.
I was just saying that would make a really good sci-fi film of
Yeah.
of like the next mutation that is able
Yeah, I
to withstand
think that
climate
they-
change and.
I mean, there are several ones that I think where they do that, where essentially humans are having to. Well, certainly the way we often envision the next level of, it's often computers, right? So there's a fear that humans have that we'll have developed a Skynet, the Terminator or whatever, right? So that's usually where we tend to envision the next life form as a mechanical one, but it could be biological too. That's a story, or they could do a biological story. Well, so that has gotten us to the end, and so I hope anyway. I mean, you might still at the end of this agree with the dismissive comment, that early, that thinkers post. Into the Renaissance, had at the thinkers in the Middle Ages in terms of this. But on the other hand, if you might be of that bent, you might just think all philosophers are kind of dry in the first place. What I would say is that having opened up this kind of like one of these very core and long thought experiments involving angels, we can at least kind of understand a little bit better where some of these medieval thinkers were coming from. And so I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you.